On a frozen Monday morning in November 1995, a retired surgeon pushed open the door of a remote cabin in Oakland County, Michigan, and walked into an impossibility. The woman who'd rented it 5 days earlier was gone, vanished, but her boots still sat by the door. Her coat hung on its peg, and outside fresh snow blanketed the ground in every direction. Smooth, untouched, unbroken, no footprints leading away, no tire tracks cutting through the white. Just silence, and a question that would haunt investigators for nearly 3 decades. How do you disappear from a locked room in the middle of nowhere without leaving a trace? Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me, where in the world are you watching this from? I want to know who's riding along on this one. Her name was Samantha Cole, and if you'd passed her on the street that November, you wouldn't have thought twice. 32 years old, soft-spoken, with paint-stained fingers and a sketchbook she carried everywhere. She made her living drawing plants, botanical illustrations for textbooks and nature journals, the kind of meticulous work that required patience, precision, and a love for the small, quiet details most people overlook. She lived in Ann Arbor, in a second-floor walk-up with a bay window that caught the afternoon light just right. Her sister later said Samantha could spend hours at that window, sketching the same branch over and over, chasing some version of it only she could see. She wasn't running from anything. No messy breakup, no mounting debts, no enemies lurking in the shadows of her past. She was just tired of the noise, the distractions, the constant hum of a city that never quite let her think. So when she saw the handwritten listing tacked to the corkboard at the Lake Orion general store, she didn't hesitate. Cabin for rent, quiet, no phone, no neighbors, cash only. It was exactly what she needed. The cabin belonged to a man named Marin Vest, a retired orthopedic surgeon who'd bought the property years earlier as a place to fish and forget about the operating room. It sat a quarter-mile off County Road 706, tucked into a dense stretch of white pine and birch along the western edge of the Clinton River. You couldn't see it from the road. The only way in was a narrow gravel drive that wound through the trees like a scar, and in winter, after the first real snow, that drive became more of a suggestion than a route. Vest rented it out a few times a year, always off the books, always to people who wanted to be left alone. No deposit, no contract. Just a signed waiver acknowledging that if something went wrong out there, help wasn't coming fast. Samantha signed it without reading it twice. She told her sister she'd be gone 5 days. 5 days to sketch, to breathe, to reset. She packed light: clothes, art supplies, a few books, a thermos of coffee that would be cold by the time she arrived. On the afternoon of November 17, 1995, she loaded her car and drove north out of Ann Arbor, leaving the suburbs behind for the kind of landscape that swallows sound. By the time she reached Lake Orion, the sky had turned the color of old steel, and the first flakes of snow were starting to fall. Her last confirmed stop was 3 miles south of the cabin at a place called Bula Fuel and Feed, a combination gas station, bait shop, and last-chance supply store for anyone heading into the backwoods. The security camera above the register caught her at 3:47 p.m., grainy and colorless, moving through the aisles with the unhurried ease of someone who had nowhere to be but exactly where she was going. She bought firewood, 2 gallons of kerosene, a bag of apples, and a paperback mystery novel with a torn cover. At the counter, she smiled at the cashier, a woman named Darlene Kopp, who'd worked there long enough to recognize the look of someone seeking solitude. "Heading up to one of the cabins?" Darlene asked. Samantha nodded. "Just for a few days, need some quiet." "Well, you picked the right week for it. Storm's coming in tonight. You'll have all the quiet you can handle." Samantha laughed, a soft, easy sound, and tucked the mystery novel into her bag. She wore a grey wool peacoat and a knit cap with a small embroidered cardinal on the brim, the kind of detail you wouldn't remember unless you had to. As she pushed through the door, she turned back and waved. Darlene waved back. 47 seconds of footage. The last time anyone saw Samantha Cole alive. Or so they thought. The snow started in earnest that night, thick, heavy, relentless. By Thursday, Lake Orion was buried under 8 inches, and the forecast promised more. The kind of storm that turns roads into traps and makes the woods feel like another planet. Maron Vest wasn't worried. He'd rented the cabin to plenty of people who'd stayed longer than planned because of weather. He figured Samantha would wait it out, maybe stretch her retreat to 6 or 7 days, then return the key when the roads cleared. He didn't expect her Sunday morning. He didn't even expect her Monday. But by Monday afternoon, something felt off. Vest drove his pickup as far as the gravel drive would allow, then parked and continued on foot. The snow had stopped overnight, leaving everything still and bright under a pale sun. His boots crunched through the crust with every step, the only sound for miles. When the cabin finally came into view through the trees, he stopped. Smoke should have been rising from the chimney. There should have been tracks in the snow, hers or anyone's. But there was nothing. Just the cabin, small and dark, sitting in the clearing like a held breath. He climbed the 3 wooden steps to the porch and knocked. "Miss Cole? It's Maron Vest, just checking in." Nothing. He knocked again, louder this time, and called her name. The silence that came back felt wrong, not empty, but waiting. He pulled the spare key from his coat pocket, slid it into the lock, and turned. The door opened with a soft creak, and cold air rolled out to meet him. Inside, everything was exactly as it should have been. And that was the problem. The cabin was a single room, bed in one corner, wood stove in the other, a small table by the window overlooking the river. Samantha's suitcase sat open on the bed, clothes folded neatly inside as if she'd been planning to pack but hadn't gotten around to it. A charcoal sketch lay on the table, half finished, a winterberry branch, delicate and precise, the kind of work that takes hours. Beside it, a mug of tea long cold, a faint ring of condensation still visible on the wood. Her boots were lined up by the door, laces tied. Her grey peacoat hung from a wooden peg near the entry, the cardinal cap tucked into one pocket. But Samantha was gone. Vest stepped back outside, his breath fogging in the cold. He scanned the clearing, the tree line, the narrow path that led down to the river. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, maybe 2 inches, and it lay smooth and unbroken in every direction. No footprints leading toward the road, no tracks heading into the woods, no sign that anyone had come or gone since the storm. It was as if she'd simply ceased to exist. He stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of it, trying to find the logic in what he was seeing. Then he turned, walked back to his truck, and drove straight to the Oakland County Sheriff's Office. By 4:30 that afternoon, 2 deputies were at the cabin, and by nightfall, it was a crime scene. Except no one could say what the crime was. The door had been locked from the inside. Vest had used his spare key to get in, and the interior bolt was still in place. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood, no broken glass. The windows were latched shut. The wood stove was cold, but there was still kindling stacked beside it, unused. Everything suggested she'd simply stepped out for a moment, except she hadn't. She couldn't have, not without leaving tracks, not without taking her coat, not in the middle of a snowstorm that would have killed her in under an hour. The lead detective assigned to the case was a man named Raymond Kowalski, a 23-year veteran of the Oakland County Sheriff's Department with a reputation for being thorough, patient, and impossible to rattle. He walked the cabin 3 times that first night, cataloging every detail, every inconsistency, every question that didn't have an answer. He stood in the doorway and stared out at the snow, trying to see what he was missing. Because something was missing, someone was missing, and the snow wasn't talking. By Tuesday morning, the case had gone from a welfare check to a full-scale missing person investigation. Search teams assembled at first light, deputies, volunteers, K-9 units, even a helicopter from the state police. They combed the woods in grids, dragging the frozen edges of the Clinton River, checking abandoned hunting blinds and old logging roads. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees, and the wind cut through layers like a blade. If Samantha had wandered out into that, disoriented or injured, she wouldn't have lasted long. But if that's what happened, where was her body? They found nothing, not a scrap of fabric, not a footprint, not a single thread of evidence that she'd ever left the cabin. Kowalski interviewed Maron Vest first, standard procedure. Vest was cooperative, almost eager to help. He provided receipts, alibis, phone records. He'd been in Detroit that weekend, visiting his daughter and her newborn son. A dozen people could confirm it. He passed a polygraph without a flicker. He wasn't hiding anything. He was just a man who'd rented a cabin to a stranger and now couldn't understand how she'd disappeared from it. Next was Darlene Kopp, the cashier from Beulah Fuel and Feed. She remembered Samantha clearly, calm, polite, looking forward to the quiet. Nothing unusual. No one following her. No strange cars in the lot. Just a woman buying supplies for a few days alone. Darlene watched the security footage with Kowalski, and when it ended, she shook her head. She seemed happy, Darlene said quietly, like she was exactly where she wanted to be. Kowalski pulled Samantha's phone records. Landline calls only. This was 1995. The last call she'd made was to her sister, the day before she left Ann Arbor. They talked for 11 minutes. Her sister said Samantha sounded excited, maybe a little tired, but nothing out of the ordinary. No mention of meeting anyone. No plans beyond sketching and solitude. When Kowalski asked if Samantha had any enemies, any reason to disappear, her sister laughed, a bitter, broken sound. Samantha didn't have enemies. She had plants and pencils and a life so quiet you could hear it from across the room. This doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense. And she was right. It didn't. The story hit the local news first. Woman vanishes from locked cabin in Lake Orion, and within days it had spread across Michigan, then beyond. Reporters camped out at the edge of County Road 706, filming stand-ups in front of the cabin, speculating wildly about what might have happened. The theories came fast and frantic. She'd staged her own disappearance. She'd been abducted by someone who knew the area. She'd suffered a mental break and wandered into the woods. She'd been taken by someone she knew, someone she trusted. But every theory had a hole. Every explanation required ignoring something that didn't fit. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button right now, because this case is about to get even stranger, and you're not going to want to miss what happens next. Seriously, subscribe. You'll thank me later. Now here's what I need you to think about while we take a breath. Samantha Cole walked into that cabin on a Tuesday afternoon with everything she needed for 5 quiet days. By Monday, she was gone, but her boots, her coat, her belongings, everything that would have kept her alive in a Michigan winter was still there. The door was locked from the inside. The snow outside was untouched. So tell me, what's your theory? How does someone vanish from a locked room in the middle of nowhere without leaving a single trace? Drop your thoughts in the comments. What time is it where you are right now? Let me know. I want to hear what you're thinking. Because here's the thing. For nearly 30 years, no one had an answer. Not the detectives. Not the family. Not the hundreds of armchair investigators who pored over every detail of this case. Samantha Cole became a ghost story, a mystery without a solution, a name whispered in true crime forums and late-night conversations. The case went cold. The file gathered dust, and everyone moved on. Everyone except the person who knew exactly what happened that night. And in 2024, that person's name finally came to light. The first rule of a disappearance is this: people don't just vanish. They leave something behind, a thread, a mistake, a witness who saw more than they realized. But Samantha Cole broke that rule. She left nothing, and that's what made her case impossible to solve. By the second week of the investigation, Lake Orion had transformed into something it had never been before, the center of a media storm. News vans lined County Road 706. Helicopters circled overhead. Volunteers arrived by the dozens, some from as far as Grand Rapids and Lansing, ready to search the woods until they found her. The Oakland County Sheriff's Department set up a command post at the Lake Orion Community Center, and Detective Raymond Kowalski stood at the front of the room every morning, briefing teams on where to search, what to look for, and how to stay safe in temperatures that hadn't climbed above 20 degrees in days. The search effort was massive, methodical, desperate. K-9 units swept through the forest in expanding circles, their handlers watching for any sign of alertness, any indication that the dogs had caught a scent. They found deer tracks, rabbit, burrows, the frozen remains of a fox that had died weeks earlier, but no trace of Samantha. Divers in dry suits broke through the ice along the Clinton River, dragging the murky bottom with hooks and sonar equipment, searching for a body that wasn't there. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through the snow, eyes down, calling her name into the wind, and every night they came back empty-handed. It was as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Kowalski didn't sleep much those first 2 weeks. He'd go home to his apartment in Pontiac, stare at the ceiling for a few hours, then drive back to the cabin before dawn. He walked the property over and over, trying to see what he was missing. He stood in the doorway where Maren Vest had stood, looking out at the clearing, at the trees, at the snow that had erased every answer. He studied the half-finished sketch on the table, the Winterberry branch, delicate and unfinished, as if Samantha had been interrupted mid-stroke. He opened her suitcase, sifted through her clothes, looking for anything that might tell him where she'd gone or why. But there was nothing. Just the ordinary debris of a life paused mid-sentence. And then there was the locked door. That detail gnawed at him. The cabin door had been locked from the inside when Vest arrived, bolted shut, requiring the spare key to open. If someone had taken Samantha, how had they locked the door behind them? If she'd left on her own, why lock it at all? And if she'd walked out into the storm, why were her boots still by the door, her coat still hanging on the peg? Kowalski brought in a locksmith to examine the mechanism. No signs of tampering, no scratches, no indication that anyone had picked it or forced it. He checked the windows, latched from the inside, every one of them. He crawled under the cabin, looking for a trapdoor, a hidden exit, anything that might explain how someone could leave without leaving. There was nothing, just frozen ground and spiderwebs. It was a locked room mystery, the kind you read about in novels. Except this was real. And Samantha Cole was really gone. The investigation shifted. If the cabin couldn't tell them what happened, maybe Samantha's life could. Kowalski and his team tore through her background with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for suspects, not victims. They interviewed her sister, her friends, her colleagues at the Botanical Journal where she freelanced. They pulled her bank records, her credit card statements, her medical history. They talked to her landlord, her neighbors, the woman who ran the art supply store in Ann Arbor, where Samantha bought her pencils and paper. They were looking for cracks, something hidden, something dark, something that might explain why a woman would vanish without a word. They found nothing. Samantha Cole was exactly who she appeared to be, quiet, talented, unremarkable in every way except her art. She had $3,200 in her checking account, no debts, no gambling habits, no secret addictions. She didn't drink much, didn't do drugs, didn't have a criminal record or even a speeding ticket. Her friends described her as kind, a little shy, the type of person who'd rather stay home with a book than go to a party. Her sister said Samantha had been single for about a year after a breakup that had been mutual and drama-free. No restraining orders, no angry exes, no one with a reason to hurt her. She was boring, her sister said, and then immediately regretted the word. I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean she was safe, predictable. She wasn't the kind of person things like this happened to. But things like this had happened, and someone, somewhere, knew why. Kowalski started building a list of persons of interest, not suspects, not yet, but people who'd been in Samantha's orbit in the days and weeks before she disappeared. The list was short, and it got shorter fast. Maren Vest, the cabin owner, was at the top. He'd been cleared early, but Kowalski revisited him anyway, just to be sure. Vest sat across from him in the interview room at the sheriff's office, patient and cooperative, answering every question the same way he had the first time. Yes, he'd rented the cabin to Samantha. No, he'd never met her before. No, he didn't know anything about her except that she'd paid cash and signed the waiver. His alibi was airtight. He'd been in Detroit the entire weekend, surrounded by family. His daughter confirmed it. His son-in-law confirmed it. Even the nurses at the hospital where his grandson had been born confirmed it. Vest wasn't hiding anything. He was just unlucky enough to own the place where a woman had disappeared. Next was Darlene Kopp, the cashier from Beulah Fuel and Feed. Kowalski interviewed her 3 times, each time hoping she'd remember some detail she'd missed before. A car following Samantha, a man watching her from the parking lot, anything. But Darlene's story never changed. Samantha had been alone, calm, happy even. No one had followed her in or out. The security footage backed her up. 47 seconds of a woman buying firewood and apples, then walking out the door into a storm she'd never walk out of. There was a drifter, a man named Carl Hennigan, who'd been spotted near Lake Orion around the time Samantha disappeared. He'd been living out of his car, doing odd jobs for cash, staying just under the radar. Deputies picked him up 2 weeks into the investigation and brought him in for questioning. Hennigan was nervous, evasive, the kind of guy who looked guilty even when he wasn't. But his timeline didn't match. He'd been in Flint the weekend Samantha vanished. Panhandling outside a grocery store. 3 people remembered him. Security footage confirmed it. He wasn't their guy. Then there was the ex-boyfriend, a man named David Trask, a librarian from Ann Arbor who'd dated Samantha for about 8 months before they'd broken up the previous winter. Kowalski drove down to interview him, half expecting resistance, maybe even hostility. Instead, he found a man who seemed genuinely devastated. Trask said the breakup had been amicable. They'd wanted different things, drifted apart, stayed friendly. He hadn't seen or spoken to Samantha in months. His alibi checked out, too. He'd been working the reference desk at the Ann Arbor Public Library the entire weekend, surrounded by witnesses and time-stamped checkout records. Every lead went nowhere. Every person of interest turned into a dead end. And the questions kept piling up. Why had Samantha locked the door from the inside? Why hadn't she taken her coat? Why was her tea still sitting on the counter as if she'd only stepped away for a moment? And most haunting of all, where was her body? Because by now, 3 weeks into the investigation, Kowalski was operating under the assumption that Samantha Cole was dead. No one survives that long in a Michigan winter without shelter, without supplies, without help. If she'd wandered into the woods, exposure would have killed her in hours. If someone had taken her, they would have left evidence, tire tracks, footprints, something. But there was nothing, just absence, just silence. The media loved it. They always do. By December, the case had gone national. Dateline sent a crew. Unsolved Mysteries aired a segment. Tabloids ran wild with theories. Some plausible, most absurd. She'd been abducted by a serial killer. She'd faked her death and fled to Canada. She'd been the victim of a cult operating in the backwoods of Michigan. One particularly unhinged theory suggested she'd been taken by something not human at all, some creature that lived in the forest and left no trace. Kowalski ignored the noise and focused on the facts. But the facts weren't cooperating. He brought in a criminal profiler from the FBI, a woman named Dr. Lawrence Cade, who specialized in abduction cases. She spent 2 days reviewing the evidence, walking the cabin, studying the timeline. When she finally sat down with Kowalski, her assessment was blunt. If this was an abduction, she said, it was planned. Whoever took her knew the area, knew the cabin, knew she'd be alone. They didn't leave evidence because they didn't make mistakes, and that suggests experience. You think this wasn't their first time, Kowalski said. I think if someone did this and got away with it, they're very, very good at what they do. It was the worst possible answer, because it meant they were looking for someone who might have done this before, and might do it again. Kowalski started pulling cold cases from surrounding counties, looking for patterns, missing women, unsolved disappearances, anything that matched the profile. He found 3 cases that made his stomach turn. A woman who'd vanished from a campsite near Traverse City in 1989. Another who'd disappeared from a rental cottage in Oscoda in 1992. A third who'd gone missing from a bed and breakfast in Alpena in 1994. All of them alone. All of them in remote locations. None of them ever found. He requested the files, started comparing details, looking for connections. But before he could find any, the case went cold. Not all at once. It happened slowly, the way these things always do. The search teams stopped coming. The media moved on to the next tragedy. Tips dried up. Leads evaporated. By the spring of 1996, the Samantha Cole investigation had been reduced to a single detective sitting in a basement office, surrounded by boxes of evidence that refused to speak. Kowalski kept working it. He couldn't let it go. Every few months, He'd pull the file, reread the witness statements, study the crime scene photos, hoping something new would jump out at him. It never did. In 1998, he requested cadaver dogs to search the woods again. They found nothing. In 2001, he drove back to the cabin, now owned by a young couple from Detroit who had no idea what had happened there, and walked the property one more time. Still nothing. In 2008, Raymond Kowalski retired. He was 63 years old, and he'd spent 13 years chasing a ghost. At his retirement party, a colleague asked him what case he'd never been able to solve. Kowalski didn't hesitate. "Samantha Cole," he said. "I think about her every day." The case was officially classified as cold in 2010. The file was boxed up and moved to a storage facility in Pontiac, where it sat on a shelf alongside hundreds of other unsolved cases, names and faces and questions that would never be answered. Samantha's sister never stopped looking. She kept the case alive online, posting updates on message boards and true crime forums, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Every year, on the anniversary of Samantha's disappearance, she held a vigil in Lake Orion. At Tiaa, first, dozens of people came, then a handful, then just her, standing alone in the snow, holding a candle and a photograph of a woman the world had forgotten. Life moved on. Lake Orion changed. New families moved in. Old businesses closed. The cabin where Samantha had disappeared was sold twice more, each time to buyers who didn't know or didn't care about its history. The case became a footnote, a local legend, the kind of story people told around campfires to scare each other. But legends have a way of coming back. In the fall of 2024, the Oakland County Sheriff's Department reopened the Samantha Cole case, not because of new evidence, not because of a tip, but because of technology that hadn't existed in 1995. Genealogical DNA databases, advanced forensic analysis, digital reconstruction tools that could pull details from decades-old evidence that investigators had missed the first time. A new detective was assigned to the case. Her name was Alicia Brennan, 34 years old, sharp as a blade, with a reputation for solving cases everyone else had given up on. She'd heard about Samantha Cole in training. Every cold case detective in Michigan had. It was the kind of case that haunted you, the kind that made you wonder if you were smart enough, persistent enough, lucky enough to be the one who finally cracked it. Brennan requested the file, all 12 boxes of it. She spent a month reading every report, every witness statement, every scrap of paper that had been generated in the original investigation. And then she found it, a single piece of evidence that had been logged, photographed, and filed away in 1995, but never fully analyzed. A fiber, synthetic, blue, found on the windowsill of the cabin. It hadn't matched anything Samantha owned, hadn't matched anything Maren Vest owned. In 1995, they'd tested it against known samples and come up empty. But in 2024, Brennan had access to databases that hadn't existed back then, databases that could match fibers to specific manufacturers, specific products, specific years of production. She sent the fiber to the state forensics lab. 3 weeks later, she got a call. The fiber came from a jacket, a specific brand, a specific model, sold in Michigan between 1992 and 1996. Brennan pulled sales records, cross-referenced them with the list of people who'd been interviewed in the original investigation, and then she saw it, a name that had been in the file all along, buried in the background, never flagged as significant. Someone who'd been in Lake Orion in November 1995, someone who'd known about the cabin, someone who'd participated in the search efforts, expressed sympathy to the family, and then disappeared into the fabric of the community, hiding in plain sight for 29 years. Brennan ran the name through every database she had access to, and what she found made her blood run cold. So here's what I need you to ask yourself. What if the person who took Samantha Cole wasn't a stranger? What if they were someone the investigators had already talked to, someone they'd cleared, someone they'd trusted? What if that person had been watching the whole time, watching the search, watching the family, watching the case go cold, knowing they'd gotten away with it? How does that change everything? Here's the equation that Detective Alicia Brennan scribbled on a whiteboard in the cold case unit on a Tuesday morning in October 2024. Opportunity plus access plus motive equals a name no one had been looking for. And when she finally solved for X, the answer didn't just shock the community, it shattered everything they thought they knew about the last 29 years. The fiber was the key. That single blue thread found on the windowsill of the cabin in 1995, catalogued and forgotten, had been waiting almost 3 decades to tell its story. When the state forensics lab matched it to a specific jacket, a Northridge parka sold at outdoor retailers across Michigan between 1992 and 1996, Brennan knew she had something. It wasn't much, but it was more than anyone had in nearly 30 years. She pulled the sales records. Hundreds of jackets sold, hundreds of names, but only one name that appeared in both the sales database and the original case file. His name was Thomas Leland, and in November 1995, he'd been a 34-year-old wildlife conservation officer for the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, assigned to the Lake Orion district. Brennan sat back in her chair and stared at the name on her screen, Thomas Leland. She flipped through the original case file until she found him. A single interview, 2 pages long, conducted on November 27, 1995, 10 days after Samantha disappeared. He'd been questioned as part of the routine canvassing of local residents and workers in the area. He told investigators he'd been patrolling the state forest that weekend, checking hunting permits and monitoring trails. He'd heard about the missing woman, offered to help with the search, even joined a volunteer team for 2 days, walking the woods alongside deputies and civilians, calling Samantha's name into the cold, and then he'd faded into the background. Just another helpful local, just another face in the crowd. Brennan pulled his employment records. Thomas Leland had worked for the DNR for 12 years, from 1989 to 2001. Clean record, no complaints, no disciplinary actions. He'd resigned in 2001 citing personal reasons and moved to Traverse City, where he'd taken a job as a manager at a sporting goods store. He'd married in 2003, had 2 kids, coached Little League, volunteered at his church. By all appearances, he was a model citizen, the kind of guy you'd trust to watch your house while you were on vacation. But Brennan had learned a long time ago that appearances were just another kind of lie. She ran his name through the criminal databases. Nothing, no arrests, no warrants, not even a traffic ticket. She pulled his financial records, credit cards, bank statements, tax returns. Everything looked normal. Too normal, maybe. Like a life carefully constructed to avoid scrutiny. And then she found the property records. In 1994, Thomas Leland had purchased a small parcel of land in Oscoda County, about 90 miles north of Lake Orion. 40 acres of dense forest, accessible only by a logging road that hadn't been maintained in years. He'd paid cash, never built on it, never developed it, just owned it quietly for 30 years. Brennan stared at the map on her screen, at the isolated plot of land surrounded by nothing but trees and silence, and she thought about the 3 other cases Kowalski had flagged back in 1996, the women who'd disappeared from remote locations across northern Michigan. One of them had vanished from Oscoda. She picked up the phone and called the Oscoda County Sheriff's Department. 2 days later, a team of forensic investigators and cadaver dogs descended on Thomas Leland's property. They worked in grids, methodical and silent, the dogs moving through the underbrush with their noses low. It took 6 hours. And then one of the dogs alerted. They found her 20 feet from the tree line, buried in a shallow grave that had been hidden for 29 years beneath layers of soil and pine needles and thyme. The remains were skeletal, but dental records confirmed what Brennan already knew in her gut. Samantha Cole had been found. The forensic team worked the site for 3 days, excavating carefully, documenting everything. They found fragments of clothing, a grey wool peacoat, a knit cap with an embroidered cardinal. They found her sketchbook, waterlogged and disintegrating but still recognizable, and they found evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull, a single devastating blow that had likely killed her instantly. But they found something else too, something that made Brennan's hands shake when she read the report. They found 3 other graves, 3 other women, 3 other victims, all buried within 100 yards of Samantha, all in various stages of decomposition. The oldest had been there since at least 1989. The most recent had been buried in 1998. Dental records and DNA would eventually identify them as the women from the cold cases Kowalski had flagged years earlier. The ones who'd disappeared from campsites and cottages and remote rentals across northern Michigan. The ones everyone had assumed were isolated tragedies, unconnected and unsolvable. They'd all been connected, and Thomas Leland had been the connection. On the morning of October 18, 2024, Detective Alicia Brennan and a team of officers pulled up to a modest 2-story house in a quiet subdivision in Traverse City. The lawn was neatly mowed. A basketball hoop stood in the driveway. A minivan with a proud parent of an honor student bumper sticker sat in the garage. Thomas Leland answered the door in a flannel shirt and jeans, a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked older now, 63, graying at the temples, lines around his eyes that came from years of smiling at neighbors and coaching kids and living a life that looked from the outside utterly unremarkable. Brennan showed him her badge. "Thomas Leland, I'm Detective Alicia Brennan with the Oakland County Sheriff's Department. I need you to come with me." He didn't ask why, didn't protest, didn't demand a lawyer. He just set down his coffee, kissed his wife on the cheek, and walked out the door with his hands already reaching for the cuffs. His neighbors watched from their porches and driveways, confused and horrified as the man they'd known for over 2 decades was placed in the back of a police cruiser and driven away. One of them would later tell a reporter, "I've known Tom for 15 years. He helped me build my deck. He brought us casseroles when my mom died. I can't believe it. I just can't believe it." But belief doesn't change facts, and the facts were undeniable. In the interrogation room, Thomas Leland sat across from Brennan and said nothing for the first hour. He didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't deny anything, just sat there, calm and still, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for 29 years and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. Brennan laid out the evidence piece by piece, the fiber from the jacket, the property in Oscoda, the graves, the remains, Samantha's coat, her sketchbook, the 3 other women. And then she asked the question that had haunted investigators since 1995. "How did you get her out of the cabin without leaving footprints?" Leland looked up, and for the first time he smiled. "I didn't leave through the door," he said quietly. "I left through the window, and then I locked it from the outside using a piece of wire threaded through the latch, pulled it tight, snapped the wire, let it fall inside. Took me 30 seconds. The snow didn't start falling heavy until after midnight. By then, I was already gone." It was that simple, that calculated, that cold. He'd been patrolling the area as part of his job, had seen Samantha arrive at the cabin, had watched her through the trees. He knew the property, knew Marin Vest, knew the cabin was isolated, that no one would hear her scream, that the storm would cover his tracks. He'd waited until dark, knocked on the door, told her there was a problem with the well pump, that he was there to help. She'd let him in. Why wouldn't she? He was a conservation officer. He had a badge. He was supposed to keep people safe. And then he'd killed her. He'd carried her body out through the woods to his truck, parked a quarter-mile away on an old logging trail. He'd driven north to his property in Oscoda and buried her before dawn. Then he'd driven back to Lake Orion, joined the search effort, and played the part of the concerned volunteer, all while knowing exactly where she was. "Why?" Brennan asked. "Why Samantha? Why any of them?" Leland shrugged. "Because I could." It was the answer that explained everything and nothing. There was no grand motive, no tragic backstory, no trauma that had twisted him into something monstrous. He'd killed because he'd wanted to, because he'd had the opportunity, because he'd been smart enough to get away with it. And he had, for 29 years. The arrest made national news within hours. Woman missing since 1995. Found. Conservation officer arrested in serial killings. The story dominated every outlet, every feed, every conversation. Lake Orion was flooded with reporters again, just like it had been in 1995. But this time they weren't asking questions, they were getting answers. Samantha's sister stood in front of the cameras outside the Oakland County Courthouse, tears streaming down her face, and said the words she'd been waiting 3 decades to say. "We finally know. After all this time, we finally know what happened to her. And I can tell you—" her voice broke. "I can tell you that Samantha didn't suffer alone. She's not lost anymore. She's coming home." The community reacted with a mix of shock, grief, and rage. Thomas Leland had lived among them, had smiled at them, had helped them, had hidden in plain sight while the families of his victims spent decades wondering, searching, hoping. People who'd known him struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster he'd always been. One of his former Little League players, now in his 30s, told a reporter, "He taught me how to throw a curveball. He came to my high school graduation, and the whole time, he was—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Raymond Kowalski, the original lead detective, now 79 years old and living in a retirement community in Florida, got the call from Brennan the day of the arrest. He sat on his porch, phone pressed to his ear, and wept. "I knew she didn't just disappear," he said. "I knew someone had taken her. I just couldn't prove it. I'm glad, God, I'm so glad, that someone finally did." The legal proceedings moved quickly. Thomas Leland was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. He pleaded guilty to all of them in exchange for life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was no trial, no dramatic courtroom showdown. Just a man in an orange jumpsuit standing before a judge and admitting in a flat, emotionless voice that he'd killed 4 women and buried them in the woods like they were nothing. At his sentencing hearing, Samantha's sister read a victim impact statement. She talked about the years of not knowing, the birthdays and holidays spent wondering if her sister was alive somewhere, the guilt of moving on with her life while Samantha's remained frozen in 1995. She talked about the relief of finally having answers and the unbearable weight of knowing what those answers were. "You took my sister," she said, looking directly at Leland. "But you didn't take her memory. You didn't take her art. You didn't take the love we had for her, and you didn't win. Because we never stopped looking, and we found her." Leland didn't react, didn't apologize, didn't show a flicker of remorse. He was led out of the courtroom in chains, and that was the last time the public saw him. Samantha Cole's remains were returned to her family. She was buried in Ann Arbor, in a small cemetery near the apartment where she'd lived, under a headstone that read, "Samantha Cole, 1963-1995, artist, sister, found." Her sister planted a winterberry bush beside the grave, the same plant Samantha had been sketching the night she died. The case became a turning point in how cold cases are investigated in Michigan. The use of genealogical DNA, advanced forensic analysis, and cross-referencing old evidence with new technology became standard practice. Samantha's case proved that no case is ever truly unsolvable. It just takes the right person, the right tools, and the refusal to give up. Detective Alicia Brennan was promoted to head of the cold case unit. She keeps a photograph of Samantha Cole on her desk, the one from the gas station security footage, where she's waving at the camera, smiling, about to walk out into a storm she'd never escape. Brennan looks at it every day, a reminder that every victim deserves justice, no matter how long it takes. Lake Orion has moved on, the way communities always do. The cabin where Samantha disappeared still stands, though it's been renovated and rented out to people who don't know its history. The woods are still quiet. The snow still falls heavy in November. But the mystery is gone. The ghost has been laid to rest. And Thomas Leland sits in a cell in a maximum security prison in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where he'll spend the rest of his life. He doesn't get visitors, doesn't get letters, doesn't get the chance to hurt anyone ever again. Samantha Cole went to that cabin looking for peace, 5 days of silence, sketching, and solitude. She deserved to find it. She deserved to come home on her own terms, with her art and her dreams and her whole life still ahead of her. Instead, she became a cautionary tale, a cold case, a name on a list of women who'd been stolen from the world by a man who thought he was smarter than everyone else. But here's the thing about monsters. They always make a mistake, They always leave something behind, and eventually someone finds it. Samantha's story didn't end in that cabin in 1995. It ended in 2024, when a detective refused to let her be forgotten, when science caught up to evil, when a single blue fiber tied a killer to his crimes. It ended with answers, with justice, with a family that could finally, after 29 years, say goodbye. So here's what I need from you. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the victims we forget, the cases we give up on, the families who never stop searching, then do something about it. Share this video. Make sure Samantha's name is heard. Make sure people know that justice isn't always fast, but it's worth fighting for. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because there are more stories like this, stories that need to be told, cases that need to be solved, voices that need to be heard. And drop a comment right now. Tell me, what's your biggest takeaway from Samantha's case? What does this story make you think about? I want to hear from you. I want to know this mattered. Because Samantha Cole mattered. She was an artist, a sister, a woman who loved quiet mornings and winterberry branches and the way light fell through a window. She wasn't just a victim, she was a person, and she deserved better than what happened to her. But because people refused to forget her, because investigators kept searching, because her sister kept fighting, because a detective in 2024 looked at a 29-year-old fiber and said, "Not on my watch," Samantha finally got the one thing that had been stolen from her that night in November 1995. She got to come home.